Good evening. I would like to start by acknowledging the country that I am on, the Eora Nation and the Eora people. I would also like to acknowledge the elders of this land and any First Nations people in this room. I would also like to mention that I am not the voice for First Nations people of Australia. My name is Emily Perez, nee Kennedy Fuller. I live in Mount Druitt from Greater Western Sydney. I'm a Tabaga, Wayadri and Gumbaynggirr woman and the first First Nation costume student at the National Institute of Dramatic Art, NIDA. Thank you. Thank you. One aspect of the NIDA costume course is for our class to make costumes for each other and then to fit the costumes on each other. The costumes we make vary from the years between the 1500s to the 1950s. What I discovered in the fitting process was the difficulty in wearing costumes from periods of history when my people were considered subhuman and not fit to be in society. Even though I love history, I love historical costumes, overall I found the costume did not reflect me as a First Nations person. Over the years, I have found there are areas of improvement and growth within the industry regarding First Nations people. Through conversations with other First Nations performers, I have discovered that there is little cultural consideration in the costume fitting process. I soon realised the importance of having these conversations before fitting a costume. As industry professionals, it is our responsibility to make each performer feel comfortable and culturally safe in their costume and to be sensitive to their needs. There is a great need for a thoroughly researched guide on collaborating with First Nations people of Australia with costume in mind. I decided to research and write a guide called The Etiquette of Fitting First Nations People of Australia. This guide is a start for a more in-depth guide book that I hope to write in my future career. The research I conducted for this guide was done through many interviews with my elders, industry professionals in mediums such as television, movies and theatre, coming from big names like Bangarra and NIDA, as well as helpful websites and my own experiences as a Tabaga, Wayadri and Gumbaynggirr woman. One thing we need to be conscious of is the diversity of nations within this country. My grandmother always said that we are nations within nations. Currently there are over 500 nations and over 250 languages. Not dialects, but languages. That is a lot for a small continent. This is important to remember as the diversity of these nations is as complex as the nations on the European or Asian continents. For example, the drive from Sydney to Brisbane is approximately 1,000 kilometres. That is the same distance from Paris to Berlin, passing through Belgium. So you would pass through three countries, and even though they are on the same continent, Paris, Belgium and Berlin have very different culture and traditions, and that is the same for us. So that drive from Sydney to Brisbane, you would have passed through approximately 8 nations that are so diverse with different traditions and nations. Given the diversity of this country, it would be difficult to understand all the cultural nuances of these many nations. There are, however, steps the industry can make to support First Nations people and to cultivate a more culturally safe environment. In the guide, The Etiquette of Fitting First Nations People, I touched on 3, and I would like to talk about these 3 things. Some tips on approaching your fittings, considerations for working with First Nation people of Australia, and shame. Firstly, some tips on approaching your fittings. When a First Nations performer comes into the space that they have not been in before, they could feel out of place. From various conversations with others, one solution would be to give them space and let them soak in their surroundings, help them to feel safe and reassure them that the fitting room is their private area for changing. Another suggestion was to have a chat before the fitting. If you can, show them the design and the costumes you're going to get them to wear. Maybe ask questions if they have any concerns about the costume. If they are silent, be assured that it is not personal. They are simply thinking and taking it in. Silence is a common trait for some First Nations people. Silence is good. Talking them through the fitting process of what you will do next is also a helpful tip. Perhaps reassure them that you are inspecting the costume and not themselves. Maybe tell them the changes that you might make. If they had any reservations about that fitting, hopefully by the next time they would feel more at ease with you because they would have got to know you and the space. Because of the, another helpful tip was to try and keep those surroundings to keep those surroundings the same as they were the first time they came in. As we are dressing the First Nations performers in the costume we have selected, we can try to be aware of what is culturally safe. First step would be to ask if there is any cultural considerations that you are aware of, you should be aware of. Secondly, considerations for working with First Nations people. While more experienced performers are comfortable changing in front of designers and costume professionals, it should be acknowledged that generally there has been a level of friendship before they went into the fitting. They are more comfortable changing in and out of somebody that they know. But always this varies with age and gender. Depending on the region, some First Nations people are not comfortable with exposed skin. However, in other nations, nudity is not seen as taboo. Both are common and both are culturally safe. During my interviews, it was mentioned to be careful around comments about a First Nations person's body and skin colour, as this could be seen as a sensitive topic for some. Remember, regardless of how much milk you put in a coffee, it's still coffee. A fantastic example was when I was on my secondment at Bangarra. The costumes for flesh garments came in colours that matched the individual First Nations performer's skin colour. Although flesh-coloured material generally comes in one colour, the costume supervisor thoughtfully considered the First Nations performers and sent the material to be dyed to each individual person. This is one example that might help yourself and lead to a more culturally safe environment. For some nations, not making direct eye contact is a sign of respect. Other considerations may include respecting men's business and women's business, where some subjects such as puberty may be reserved for the senior people of that same sex. Also, there can be strict rules about approaching older people, especially elders, with direct questions. Additionally, you may need to be aware of using names of people who have passed away, as some nations don't use these names and they can't be spoken for sometimes up to a year or more. And as always, ask permission before photographing a performer or showing them photographs of other First Nations people. And lastly, shame. Generally, shame means to feel humiliated by wrong behaviour. For First Nations people of Australia, shame can take on so many different levels. It's so hard to define shame when we are so culturally diverse, but the best way I can describe shame is to explain how it is used in my community. This is my personal use and view. Shame is a funny word. I use shame in both a negative and positive sense. I use it for deep embarrassment, but also for empathy. Shame could also have me in stitches or lead me to be walking out and never coming back. Shame can be overwhelming and stop me from doing something. Shame is a word I use in everyday speech. And although we use the word shame on different levels, if I say it in my community, everyone understands what I am saying. There is personal shame and community shame. To explain personal shame to me, it could mean a moment when you are embarrassed. It could be something that you've physically done, someone watching you, or knowing your personal business. It could be wearing something that I would not normally wear. For example, something that is short or has too much exposed skin. Regarding community shame, Atsy wrote a great article called Understanding Youths. It is when someone discusses something personal about yourself when you have no intention to share that information. For this, it could be singling you out or sharing personal health issues about yourself. And when I say big time shame, I'm in essence saying there is no way in the world I am doing that. Such as when I was in dance school, when I had dance in high school, and I was asked to roll onto the ground, get up, and shimmy. I didn't do it because it is big time shame. So you can see shame could also be used as a joke or given in lighthearted humour. Some First Nations people could also have feelings of being uncomfortable and could experience shame in its negative sense. I have found from my interviews and from myself that it is very easy to feel shame and then to spiral into negative thoughts and not return. However, First Nations people choose to use the word shame, the general meaning is the same. There are so many examples of First Nations performers who have performed in historical costumes and have had great success. By being aware of the diversity of the many nations within this country, giving space and privacy, talking them through the fitting process, again without making assumptions about all First Nations people, A helpful suggestion would be to ask if there is any cultural considerations you need to be aware of. Is a great start to building a more culturally safe environment. I would also like to say thank you to Annette Ribbons, Sue Osmond, Liza Marie and Daniel Wudakume Kennedy. Thank you for listening.